Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over a pretty cool opening. It's the Colorado Gambit. It derives from the Nimzawas to Finch. If you're not too familiar with that, that is pawn to e4, a knight c6, and then a knight to f3. Now, more common for white to play pawn to d4, but knight to f3 is probably second to that. Now, the Colorado Gambit is pawn to f5. Anytime I talk about any sort of opening or specifically a gambit, I like to talk about the soundness of this. This is a pretty good gambit. All things considered, I like to play this myself. I wouldn't necessarily take this into a tournament if I was really prepping, playing a lot of opponents, especially with, maybe 2 hours on a match or so, you have tons of time to think. This is more of kind of a surprise tactic if you're playing maybe a 15-minute, 30-minute game against an opponent. This is going to be pretty good for that, especially if you're getting into maybe a blitz or bullet type of chess game. It's definitely good for that. It can put your opponent in a lot of tough situations, but anytime you are playing a gambit, in particular playing, even for white or for black, playing a pawn on the f-file, it is going to be somewhat tricky, and it's definitely not as sound as some of the other openings out there. So don't take this to your local tournament and say that Kevin said this is the all-time greatest opening, but it is extremely fun, and you get to play it quite a bit. This is fairly common for white to play pawn e4, knight to f3, so check it out. Let me know what you guys think. We're first going to look at some of the lines where white does not take the pawn here, and some of them start with pawn to e5, just pushing forward, still has control of the center of the board. His knight on f3 is still protecting this, and then we're going to play pawn to d6. Now there's a few options that white has here. He could take with this pawn, that's fairly common. Also fairly common is just to play bishop here to b5. Now once we see this, we're going to take with our pawn here, and then usually knight takes here on e5, and then queen down here to d5. This is attacking both of these pieces, and white can kind of take with either piece if he wants to. If he takes with his knight here on c6, then we have kind of two options. We could take with our pawn here, or we could just go absolutely crazy, and we're going to say queen takes here on g2. Just a heads up, in this video, there's going to be lots of variations that we're going to look at, some of which may be just a little more sound. I'm going to be going over the crazier options. If you're going to play a gambit, specifically the Colorado Gambit, you're looking for some crazy, and that's exactly what kind of queen here to g2 is. It's still very, very solid. This knight still has to get out of the way. All of a sudden, you're attacking the rook here on h1. So this is still very good, but just kind of keep that in mind as we're going over some of these variations. Now, even from here, we could see knight takes on a7. We could see c6 attacking the bishop. All of a sudden, rook to f1, since that's being attacked. The rook can now take here on a7. The bishop's going to have to move back here. Black is actually winning in this position, so that's definitely going to be very good. If we come back and say, okay, what if the knight doesn't take there on a7? Could try something with queen to h5, but then pawn g6. Then we can see knight back here, e5, that's check, but then pawn to c6. All of a sudden, black is just in a really good spot, attacking the queen, attacking the bishop, attacking the rook. It's just kind of all over the place. White's not going to be able to castle any side very safely at all. All in all, this is going to be very, very good. Now, if we come back, even in this spot, and say, queen to g2, and then maybe knight to e5. Discovered attack on the king, and so we kind of have to deal with this knight or kind of this bishop attacking. Okay, from here, this is completely fine. We play pawn here to c6, and then maybe the bishop takes, the pawn takes. This is still going to be good. The queen is attacking both the rook, defending the square here on c6. So all in all, this is going to be very, very good for black. Now, if we come back a few moves and say, even in this particular spot, maybe the knight's not going to take, but maybe the queen automatically comes into the red zone here. Queen to h5 check. Then it gets pretty crazy. So we could see pawn to g6. We could see the knight taking here on g6. And this is a common theme you'll see throughout a lot of these variations, is the knight can always come taking on g6, because if the pawn takes, all of a sudden the rook is now going to fall here on h8. There's not a lot of protection from this king, so a lot of times that is pretty scary. But we are kind of going to go for the crazy in most of these situations. So after the pawn takes here on g6, which is what I would recommend, and the queen takes here on h8, that's fine. Queen comes down here to g2, rook f f1, and then knight f6. And this does get pretty crazy, but as you can see, that's going to be okay. White does not have good protection for his king. It's going to be very difficult for him to get all of his pieces on the queen side involved into the game. His queen, although it is very aggressive, it doesn't have any other pieces actually helping it out in the attack. So all in all, this is going to be a good attack for black. Now if we come back, we kind of looked at what happens if the knight takes. We also kind of looked at what happens if the queen gets involved. You could also take with the bishop. So bishop here on c6. We see pawn taking on c6. The knight's not going to take now. It's probably better if the knight comes back here to f3. This is more sound, but sometimes players like to be more aggressive, and they could see, you know, knight here on e5. I could play queen here to h5. This looks pretty good right here, but after queen to h5, now pawn to g6, it gets a little crazy, because if we see knight to g6, now knight to f6, and this is where it gets pretty chaotic. This is a much different situation than earlier if you kind of want to go back into it. Now white's in a really, really bad spot. Black is going to win this game more than likely. Hopefully they've watched this video and they know how to kind of approach this. But there's a lot of ways that black can just dominate, and all depends on kind of where white goes from here. We can already see if the queen is not moved, the queen is going to fall here on h5. So we can see first queen here to g5. The pawn's going to take here on g6. If the queen takes, hey, sure, that's completely fine. Check. King here to d8, and that's fine. Material, all of a sudden, black is up that minor piece. This one queen is involved, but he can't really do anything. All the other pieces are protected for black. And yes, it is a little bit chaotic, but if you look from white, he has no other pieces really involved into the action. Black is completely dominating the center of the board. All of his pieces can really dominate. These rooks can get, you know, semi-open file here, already semi-open file here on the H file. So all in all, this is going to be extremely, extremely good in-game for black. Now, if we come back and say, instead of queen to a g5, what about queen to h4? Okay, well now we could just take here on g2. This threatens both the rook here on h1, also the knight here on g6. Now, there's a few options. White could say, yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and take here on h8. Okay, perfect. We're going to go and take on h1, then king to e2, and then we have a few options. We could probably play the safer route of just bishop to a6, d3 kind of stopping that, queen over here to c1, just gobbling up material. Black is just in an absolute dominating position right here, just so many active pieces, and just doesn't have anything that he can really attack his opponent. Or if you wanted to, you could try to get a little bit more creative. After king to e2, you could play pawn to f4, just kind of stopping a lot of what your opponent is trying to do, but really opens up the door for the bishop to come here to g4. This bishop is being defended by the knight on f6, so this is really good. This queen's still attacking the bishop, so if maybe white wanted to play knight here to c3, to kind of open up for the rook to kind of defend this bishop here on c1. Then black has the very powerful bishop to g4. White has the option. He can either lose his queen and just play queen takes here on g4, or he can avoid that, but then it's going to be a checkmate from here. So the variation could continue from here. We could see king to d3, queen to f1, king up here to d4. Most of these are forced moves. Castle on the queen side, check. King up here to e5, queen here to e1. This is a pretty intense mate, but it is good if you ever actually get to do it in a game. Queen up here to e2, capture, and that knight here was just to draw the game out as much as possible. Could have lost earlier if wanted to. Now rook down here to d4, king g3, and then queen here to f3. So all in all, checkmate, but that's only if you just want to get really, really tricky and play that pawn to f4. I think it's just easier just to play bishop here to a6, so that's going to be completely fine. Now that is if your opponent takes here on h8, but if he just plays rook to f1, that's going to be completely fine as well, because you just come up here to g6, take that material, you're up that minor piece, your opponent does not have a protected king. All in all, this is going to be very, very good. So that's what happens if the queen comes there to h4. If he comes back here to h3, okay, well, this is a pretty easy game here. Pawn takes on a g6. If your opponent now wants to take on h8, that's fine. Queen takes on g2. rook here to f1, and then knight down here to g4, getting ready to get more involved into the attack. Knight takes here on g2 or h2 if he wants to. More attacks over here in the center of the board. Can always get bishop involved to a6 if he wants to. So all in all, going to be a very, very good game from black. Now if we come back a little bit further, another option that he has is queen to e2. Okay, that's another option that he has. From now, we're going to play queen takes on g2, rook over here f1, and then just pawn takes here on g6. So some of the variations that you could see if your opponent tried to play that tricky queen over here to h5. The next variations we're going to look at involve the pawn taking here on d6. Now, I've seen a couple people say that you should take over your pawn here from e7. Other people said you could take from your pawn here from c7. I think both of those are bad, just from exactly what you're trying to do. You're trying to be super, super aggressive. I don't think those accomplish really what you're trying to do. You're trying to be super aggressive, so I recommend pawn to e5. Just blast in the center of the board, and sometimes your opponent will just try to gobble up more and more material on board. That's fine. It doesn't matter to me how much material I give up on board. I'm just trying to have the most aggressive attack possible when I play the Colorado Gambit. So if they play this pawn takes on c7, hey, fantastic. Queen here to c7. I control the center of the board, which you usually don't get to say when your opponent plays pawn to e4. You have a very active board. Your light square bishop can get involved into the game. Your dark square bishop can get involved into the game. Your knight's already controlling the center of the board with these two pawns. All in all, this is going to be pretty good. Now, your opponent from here has a few options. You may see pawn to d4, trying to break up the center. Okay, pawn to e4. And this is something you'll kind of see anytime you have a pawn here on f5 and pawn to e4. You're kind of almost looking to push this pawn here to e4. Now, it gets kind of tricky because this somewhat looks like an outpost, but if we see knight to e5, we could just see an exchange on board, but after the queen takes on e5, this is going to just be much better for black. Both sides are equal in material, but black is just dominating the center of the board. White hasn't moved any of his pieces on the board, so that's not going to be good for white at all. Now, we could see a knight over here to g5, then just knight to f6. That's going to be completely fine on board. Another thing you could see is knight to c3. Okay, that's fine. We're just still going to push forward with pawn to e4. And same logic, knight here to g5, knight f6, and this is going to be completely fine. What if instead we see bishop here to c4? You probably guessed it, pawn here to e4, that's going to be fine. And then if we see something, okay, pawn to e4, he's kind of analyzed this and plays pawn to d3. Okay, we'll try something else. Bishop here to c5, getting more pieces involved into the game, just putting more pressure on our opponents. All of a sudden, our opponent tried to be pretty aggressive with pawn to e4 starting the game, and all of a sudden, black is just dominating the center of the board. So all in all, this is going to be a fairly good game for black. Now we'll go ahead and take a look at some of the other options as far as moving the pawn up here to e5. Some of them include knight to c3. Okay, we're just going to go ahead and take this material here on e4. That's fine. Now the knight could take. We're going to play pawn down here to d5, trying to control the center of the board, open up the door for some of our bishops to get involved into the game. Depending on where our opponents go, knight to c3 is probably bad, just moving it back. That seems kind of odd. We'll just push forward with pawn to d4. If he plays kind of the more logical knight over here to g3, okay, that's fine. Just push forward with pawn to e5, controlling the center of the board, opening up for both of our bishops to get involved into the game. Maybe now bishop to b5. Now bishop over here to g4. Hey, this is going to play pretty well for black. Very aggressive, knowing that there's a semi-open file for, black over here. So you may want to look to castle on the king side, have this rook control the semi-open f file. That's definitely an option on board. Now, if you see anything else in the game, don't try to overthink it. If your opponent plays bishop here to c4 just because he's going to know what you're up to and he really likes to get his bishop here to c4 to try to attack this square here on f7 that's right now not defended at all, don't overthink it. Just take here on e4. Put your opponent in a lot of pressure right here. This is going to be completely fine. You could also see some pretty boring ways that white could defend this. So pawn to d3, it's very passive. There's no way with this kind of strong defense to do anything too crazy. From this position, I usually just try to be as aggressive as possible. So pawn to e5. Now if he were to take our pawn, that's fine. Pawn to d5, opening up the door for our light square bishop to take this material back, control the center of the board, that's fine. But all in all, white could just not take this, even play bishop here to e2, castle on the king's side. They could just decide, I don't know what is going on, so I'm just going to hunker down here and try not to make any mistakes. You definitely could see that. The last variations we're going to go over is what happens if the pawn takes the gambit here on f5. Now, generally, if there's a gambit, you almost kind of want your opponent to take that gambit. In the Colorado Gambit, I actually don't want my opponent to take the gambit. I feel like they're in a stronger position when they take that pawn there on f5 than when they're not. But all in all, you still need to be aware of what happens if your opponent does take that. Now we're going to start with pawn to d5. So that's kind of the easy point. And then it comes down to what our opponent does. Now, probably the strongest move for white is if he plays bishop here to b5. And this is one of those where if I walked into a tournament and the game started like this, I would kind of second guess myself as far as why I actually, played the Colorado Gambit. My opponent's playing perfectly here. It kind of puts me in a tough spot. Now, you're not at a loss by any means. You still have a good game that you can play from here, but it's definitely not as good as some of the other variations we've looked at in this video so far. From here, you're just going to continue to take. So bishop here on f5, taking that material. And then we see knight to e5. So we've kind of seen this before, but now it kind of puts us in a bind. The bishop now needs to come back here to d7 because you're just in a tough spot. Now if the bishop takes, we see bishop take, that's fine. We could see the knight take and then the pawn recapture, that's fine. Or if we just see castle on the king's side, knight to f6, we just develop like a normal game right here. This is going to be completely fine. Now if instead of the bishop taking, we could now see the queen come into the game. So queen to h5. Pawn to g6, knight takes. We're just going to now see knight to f6, kind of as we've seen before. Now, if the queen does not come to h4 in this particular spot, because it's a little bit different. The queen can't come here to h3 because the bishop's now here, the light square bishop. So he almost has to come to h4 or it's going to be kind of a lost game. And we're going to continue with our game plan we've done before. We're going to go ahead and take here. And then if he decides to go ahead and take, hey, that's completely fine. We're just now going to play knight to b4. And this is threatening the fork here on c2. So if the bishop comes back to protect that, we're just going to go ahead and take that. And then bishop here to f5, attacking this pawn. Now, if you look at this and say, hey, this is just complete chaos. I usually like a more structured game. The Colorado Gambit's probably not for you. And anytime my opponent kind of starts out with taking that pawn and then playing the bishop up here to b5, if I can get to this chaos position, which I really like, I feel this is almost kind of a win for me, because that's kind of where I want to be. So we come back, instead of that knight to e5 early on, just from right here, so y'all kind of see this. He could also play a little bit more normal. Could play castle on the king side. This is fine. Pawn to e6, just opening up the door for the dark square bishop to get involved. I usually like to get my light square bishop out before I play this pawn to e6 so that it doesn't block it off. That's just in general terms. I like to do that as well. So this is going to be fine. The queen can get involved into the game. Black still controls the center of the board a little bit with his pawns here. So this is going to be a good game for black. Now, another move you may see from white is pawn to d4. We're going to continue with the same game plan. Bishop takes here on f5, get that material back. Now, if we see bishop here to b5, it's a little bit different before. We don't have to panic quite as much. Even if the knight comes up here to e5, that's going to be completely fine because white kind of lost a move here with pawn to d4. Now, probably a very good position for white just holistically, but he did lose a little bit. So now we could play pawn to e6 and not worry. Now if knight comes to e5, we don't have to panic as much. We don't have to, worry about any shenanigans. Instead, we can play bishop here to e6. And this is not bad at all. Now if we see knight here to c6, we could just see queen here to d7. We're not as big of a threat at all. Now we're kind of threatening the pawn taking here. Just keep in mind, if you do see any craziness, maybe knight takes here on a7, go ahead and take or play pawn to c6 just to make sure. Now he's almost kind of forced to kind of come back here, take with his knight. We are attacking both the bishop and the knight here on a7. So if you do see that, do just keep that in mind. Instead of the bishop even coming up here, if we come back here, instead of the bishop coming up here to b5, another move that we could see is knight to c3. From here, same kind of game plan, pawn to e6, and then just kind of call it a day. Now, another thing that we could see is instead of playing pawn up here to d4, our opponent could try to hold on to this pawn here on f5. You don't see it too often, but there's two ways that you could see that kind of approach. The first one is bishop here to d3. This does block off his pawn here on d2, which I don't really like myself. I think this is a poor move from white, but you could see it. From here, we're going to just start to attack more of this pawn here on f5 by playing knight to h6. Now, if his opponent tries something crazy, maybe knight to h4, then we're going to play pawn to e5. Opens up the door for our light square bishop to attack. He's really not going to take here en passant because then his knight's just going to fall. So that's going to be a mistake here. If he tries to get too crazy, maybe queen here to h5, because some players, anytime this square here on f7 is not occupied, they're always looking for the queen to come over here to h5. This is going to be fine, but you do need to bring your knight back here to f7, and then maybe the bishop comes over here to b5, pawn here to g6, and then after the exchange on board, then you essentially are going to have the queen come back here. So maybe queen comes back here to g4. Now the pawn takes. And the knight can't take here on f5. This is a really good spot for black if you kind of look at it. Yes, he's not going to be able to castle. That's going to be completely okay. But he completely controls the center of the board. Now, if you kind of look at the knight and the queen, there's two pieces both attacking the square here on f5. But knight to f5, that would lose. Queen to f6, this is pretty much just all bad for white. The knight can't move. It's kind of pinned down. The queen would lose. But then all of a sudden, the bishop's going to be taking here on f5. So that's definitely going to be bad. If instead, sometimes white will say, okay, I'm just going to concede that pawn there on f5, which they probably should do. So maybe the king castles over here. That's going to be fine. Now we can just go ahead and take our bishop or take the pawn here with our bishop as we thought, and then if he wants to take our bishop, that's fine. We'll just recapture with our knight. Now, the other option that you may see, also very uncommon, is for the pawn to come up here to g4 to hold on to it. There's a few ways to kind of attack this, but I usually play pawn to h5 just because I think the player that's going to be playing pawn to g4 is probably not a good player, and they're probably the same type of player that's going to just continue trying to control it with pawn to h3. This is kind of in that blitz or bullet game, or maybe you're just playing a subpar player that makes a lot of mistakes, and you want to know how to really just capitalize on those. Playing something like pawn here to h5. You're already the aggressive player. If they play this, okay, pawn to g4. They can't recapture because you can just come down and take their rook here on h1, but you're also threatening this knight here on f3. The knight doesn't have a lot of good moves, but it comes up here to g5. Then all of a sudden the bishop takes on f5 as we kind of wanted it to. We're controlling the center of the board. This knight's kind of in no man's land. Later on, we could look to play pawn to e5, just completely controlling the center of the board. So all in all, this is going to be a pretty good game for black. So this is the Colorado Gambit. You have a lot of opportunities to play this. So check it out. Let me know what you guys think. Try to make a pretty in-depth video. We couldn't go over all the possible lines in this, but hopefully this gave you a good idea of some of the main concepts that you need to think about when your opponent's playing in different places. If you have other ideas for openings or variations of other openings that you'd like me to take a look at, do a video on, please leave a comment, or you can also email me. That's probably even the best way. It's thechesswebsite@gmail.com. So make sure you send that feedback to me. But thanks everyone for watching. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, and let me know how you do with the Colorado Gambit.